All right, welcome to our second evolution podcast in our series. And in this podcast, we are going to look at some evidence for natural selection, meaning evidence that suggests that yes, evolution has occurred, but not only that, natural selection is the means by which that can happen and what evidence we have for that. So the first bit of evidence is something called not natural selection, but artificial selection. And this was first noticed by Darwin himself, who looked at the breeding that had occurred of domesticated plants and animals, dogs, different kinds of plants that we use for crops and things like that. So artificial selection is the changes we cause in organisms by breeding them, okay? And of course, humans have modified plants and animals over many generations by simply doing crossbreeding, by selecting individuals that had desired traits and then breeding them with each other. But as a result of this breeding, though, it is obvious that the plants and animals that we grow for food or as pets or whatever often bear very little resemblance to what their original wild ancestors looked like. For example, all of these plants over here, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbages, Brussels sprouts, all of that originally came from this plant over here, this mustard plant, okay? So this ancestral species, which looks like that, has given rise to all of these plants that really look nothing like it, but they all come from that original parent, original ancestor, okay? We also see this power of selective breeding, crossbreeding in our pets. Domestic dogs, I'm sure you already know, were originally bred from wolves. The wolves have given us all of the breeds. Let me make sure that, that we know today. And they look wildly different, not only from the wolf that they originally came from, but of course from each other. Even that little guy. So hidden variation in the genes, variety that exists within different wolves can get brought out and more exaggerated if we pick certain wolves to breed with each other and then pick offspring from those breedings to breed with each other and so on. So that hidden genetic variety gets brought out when we choose who we're going to breed with whom, okay? Same thing, this is just another example. Pigeons, again, many different kinds of pigeons with pigeon breeders crossbreed these organisms that generally look like regular city pigeons, but then once they're crossbred, this variety that is hidden in their genes is brought out, okay? Now, a more perhaps environmentally important example of artificial selection is a bit of unintentional artificial selection. Insecticide resistance, which works very much like antibiotic resistance, if you've heard of that. So insects, bugs that eat our crops are killed by certain insecticides that we spray on the crops so that these bugs will not eat the plants that we want to grow for food. However, any bug that by some genetic accident has a gene that makes them resistant to the insecticide will live. And because it lives, it will reproduce. And thus all of the critters that, so here if just focusing on the illustration here you see all the bugs with the little green gene right there, they are susceptible and they die. But this guy is not susceptible to the insecticide. He lives, he reproduces, and all the bugs that are brought forth from that point forward will have that resistance gene, plus they will have no competition, so they will thrive in the environment. That is an example of artificial selection that we are doing not intentionally, but accidentally. We do it with antibiotics too, the exact same mechanism, only with bacteria instead of insects, and antibiotics instead of insecticides, but it's the same principle. So, what Darwin reasoned, what if humans can cause so much drastic change? Imagine a wolf to a chihuahua in, generations of human existence. If humans could cause so much change to occur in a relatively short period of time, then imagine what natural selection could create, given hundreds of thousands of generations, millions of years, billions of years. So he argued then if advantages of some variations in different organisms were even just a little bit, those advantageous variations would accumulate over time, and natural selection would eliminate the less favorable variations over time. Now, so artificial selection was an example that Darwin used to suggest that natural selection could work, because certainly artificial selection quite obviously worked. The difference being that humans were causing the selection pressure in artificial selection and not the environment. Now, some other points to keep in mind, just in general. When we're discussing evolution, please remember that a population is the smallest unit that can evolve. An individual cannot evolve. Evolution can only be measured in how many organisms have the new variation over a generation after generation after generation. Individuals can't evolve. One critter with a new trait, a third eye in the back of his head or whatever, does not mean we have created a new species. Only after many, many generations, and if more and more members of the population obtain this trait, would we then say that that species has actually evolved. Please remember, we've talked about this before, natural selection can only work with an inherited variation. Not variation like a tattoo that might be acquired during the organism's lifetime, but it's not part of their genes, okay? Also, keep in mind that natural selection is situational, meaning that environments are different, and what might be really helpful in one environment might not be so helpful in another environment. Okay, so natural selection and which way it's going to go and what traits it's going to favor depend very much on the situation. And hopefully this example might illustrate that. A great example of natural selection occurring that has been studied intensely by many scientists over the years since Darwin went to the Galapagos are his finches. His hypothesis was that the different beaks found on those different Galapagos finches that we've talked about were different adaptations for different food sources on the different islands. Okay, so the beaks were adapted to the different food sources on the different islands. So let's talk about a specific finch. The medium ground finch has been studied. It's on a particular island in the Galapagos called Daphne Major, and they use their beaks to crush seeds. The seeds they most like are small seeds from certain plants that are produced in large numbers, produced in abundance during wet years on the island. Okay. In dry years, though, all seeds in general are in short supply. You can imagine that a drought would not be good for the plants. So in those kinds of cases, the finches can't just rely on the small seeds that are their favorites, but then they have to eat both any seeds that are available, small seeds, large seeds from other plants, whatever. The thing about the larger seeds is that they are harder, as you can imagine, to crush. Okay? So scientists observed over years, watching environmental change and so on, that the average beak size of the finch population changes, okay? During times of drought, when the weather is dry, the average size of the finch beaks increases. Now, not within an individual. An individual is born with the size of beak it's going to have. What we mean is from one generation to the next. Okay, but the size decreases again during the wet years. Okay, so what's happening? Beak size is, of course, an inherited trait. Okay, scientists attribute changes then in this inherited trait to the fact that big beaks are better at cracking big seeds, which are what you have to be able to do during those dry periods when there's not enough small seeds to eat. But small beaks are much more efficient at working with those little seeds that are available when the weather is wet. Okay? So what these studies of the medium ground finch have emphasized is that natural selection is situational. What's good in one environment, that wet environment, the small beak that's very efficient at getting those small seeds, is not so good when the weather turns dry. Okay? Please note that, however, the beak evolution is not a result of an acquired characteristic. The environment does not create these beaks. A blacksmith does not, this was an example, I believe, used by Darwin himself. A blacksmith and his arm, a blacksmith banging on a piece of iron and he gets a very strong arm is not going to pass his strong arm on to his children. That was created by what he had been doing in his environment. So the beaks are not created because of the presence of the large seeds. Instead, there are all kinds of different birds with different sizes of beaks that are born at any given time. The ones that are most successful depends on what the environment's like. If the environment is wet and you've got lots of small seeds, then the beaked birds will be more successful. They'll have more babies and pass those genes on. Whereas the opposite will be true in a dry environment. Okay? So the proportion of the thicker beaked finches increased during dry periods because those individuals with thicker beaks survived more in the dry periods and they would have more offspring. But if the periods went back to being wet, then those guys wouldn't be as efficient as the smaller beak birds, and then they wouldn't leave as many genes behind, and so on. So again, those are some examples of evidence that natural selection, environmental pressures, whether they come from a human or come from the environment itself, actually do cause natural selection, evolutionary change. We're going to shift now to looking at some evidence for evolution. What evidence tells us that different species actually have evolved over time. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next podcast.